Keeping Girls in the Game, which really sort of flowed out of previous projects that we've done where we've looked at participation rates, attrition rates, the different factors that influence those, but what actually will help keep girls in the game? Why do girls drop out of the game, et cetera? So I'm going to throw it over to Karen, who's going to, oops, how do you do this thing now? Okay.
Great.
There we go. So this is our agenda.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah. Go, Karen.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Marge. Over the next 25 minutes or so, Marge and I will walk you through the highlights of our latest report, Keeping Girls in the Game, Factors that Influence Sport Participation. And we'll focus on the core elements of the report, but of course, we're happy to take questions following the presentation and really any time. Of course, as you all know, our work is so aligned and there are endless opportunities for collaboration. So we really appreciate this opportunity, and we're most excited about thinking about, after this presentation, ways in which we can all translate this data into practice. So for the purposes of today, first, we'll take a look at the purpose of the research. We'll consider the research questions that help to inform our approach. We'll take a look at the methodology used in this study, some of the key findings. There are so many, but we'll highlight some of those. Then we'll talk briefly about practice and policy implications and recommendations. And finally, we'll talk about some of the WSF's latest initiatives that flow from the research. Okay, so the purpose of the research was really threefold. First was to provide new insights and really to consider the impact of interpersonal, social, contextual, and environmental influences on youth sport participation. So we're really looking here at why do girls enter sport, why do girls drop out of sport, and why do girls stay in sport. The second was really to understand differences that sort of underlie all of these things, specifically looking at the impact of gender, age, socioeconomics, and race and ethnicity, both on participation, retention, and on the dropout phenomenon. And third, to take these insights and consider how they can inform policy and practice. At the outset, as a guide for our research, we asked some of the following questions. First, what are some of the internal factors that influence the entry into and exit from sport? That included, but isn't limited to, things like self-esteem, physical health, social and emotional health, body image, family roles and dynamics. Secondly, we wanted to look at the external factors that influence the entry into and exit from sport. So those included things like race and socioeconomic status, safety concerns, environmental barriers, coaching, early specialization, and access to role models. Third, we wanted to look at the social and cultural factors that influence participation and retention. Fourth, to try to understand how specific program practices and policies impact participation. Fifth, we were looking at strategies and resources that counter some of the obstacles that girls face with regard to participation and retention. And finally, trying to discern factors and strategies that can not only improve motivation to play, but motivation to stay in sport. As far as the methodology, the WSF commissioned a national survey of more than 3,000 girls, 3,000 boys and girls and their parents to look at their participation experiences. And the survey was designed, again, to look at both entry into sport and the factors associated with exiting from sport. And we looked at all kinds of variables, child-related variables, sport-related variables, variables regarding access, experiences, motivations. And we really wanted to get sort of a holistic view, if you will, of all of these things. In terms of organized sport and how we define that as sport participation that had a coach or instructor that was involving regularly scheduled practices or competitions. That's how we sort of differentiated organized sport from other forms of free play. And children were categorized into 3 groups: those who currently play, those who dropped out, and those who never played. And I just want to clarify, when we use the term dropped out of sport, you could look at it, of course, a number of ways. And for the purposes of this study, we looked at kids who dropped out of sport altogether and stopped playing. So it wasn't that they dropped out of one sport and went to the other. These are kids who dropped out and no longer engage in any type of sport. And just before we get into sort of the heart of the research, to point out some of the limitations of the report that we're mindful of. First of all, as you'll see, this is really just a snapshot in time. It's not a longitudinal study. So there's a lot more work that we can do to study what keeps girls in sport, as well what keeps girls out of sport sort of over time. Of course, there are so many things that affect sport participation that we didn't look at here, and we can glean some of those insights from other studies, but there's more work to be done in understanding things like physical and biological factors, whether it's weight or height or the timing of puberty, and how that impacts sport participation. And of course, there are a lot of contextual and environmental conditions that impact girls' participation in play, things like being pushed out of sport or cut from sport. And in future studies, we're going to hope to examine these factors as well. And then finally, there are other areas, of course, that need to be studied more carefully. Things like gender and sexual orientation having a significant impact on youth sport, and really understanding how young people can get marginalized from participation and what we can do to address that. Also looking at young people with physical or cognitive or behavioral disabilities that impact their participation. So that's all to say that obviously our overall goal, as is yours, is to create sport environments that are as inclusive as possible. And so this report is one step forward in that direction, but there's clearly more work to be done.
Thanks, Karen. So I'm going to talk about some of the key findings, not all of them because there are a lot, but some of them. And of course, you can find this report up on our website as well, so the full report. So there were gender disparities. Girls were more likely to have never played, big surprise. They're less likely to be currently playing, also big surprise, not really. But interestingly, in this particular study, their dropout rates were similar. So we have done previous work where we have found that girls are dropping out at higher rates than boys, but in this particular study, we did not find that. There are some differences that I'll talk about in a minute, but overall, the dropout rates were similar. So there are some racial and ethnic disparities as well. And again, I'm only sort of highlighting the top line ones. You can see on the chart to the right sort of all the detail about the participation by gender and race and ethnicity. And what you can take away from this particular figure is that African American girls are the least likely to be current players. Only 28.3% of them are currently playing. And they're also, the corollary to that is, of course, they're most likely to have never played sports, and more than half have never played sports. Hispanic girls also were more likely to have never played than white girls. So 46.1% versus 39.9%. So this is just really pointing out some of this. And here you'll see, and if you look at the dropouts in sort of the middle of the figure, there should be a laser pointer thing for this. But in the middle of the figure, the dropout rates are relatively similar, although you do see that actually it's interesting, white girls are dropping out slightly higher rates than other girls. There are also, as you can expect, there are also a lot of gender disparities that are related to income. Low-income girls are the least likely to be current players. Only about a quarter of them are playing. They're most likely to have never played sports, again, more than half. and they're most likely to drop out. Low-income girls also have a much shorter window of opportunity to participate in sports. It's 1.5 years shorter for girls from low-income households. So it's 4.3 years for them compared to girls from higher income households, 5.8 years. So this means, of course, that they have less of a time to be involved in sport. And that's a pretty big gap there, where they're not getting those kinds of opportunities that other kids from higher income are getting. The gap is also there for boys, but it's not quite as large. So cost is a primary driver of entrance and retention. These findings not only support previous research that's shown that money is primary driver, but also emphasizes the need to address cost of sport to support retention in sport, prevent dropout. So here are some examples here from the work that, for example, amongst families with low household income and Hispanic families, cost of participating was identified as a primary barrier for why their child dropped out. And I should just say here, so in other words, in the survey, they were actually asked, why does your child drop out? And there are a lot of charts in the survey where you can see all the various percentages of reasons that are given, but cost was a pretty high one. Cost was also a key reason for dropping out for girls from working class families. Urban girls, for example, had transportation difficulties, a lack of access to program in terms of getting their children to practice, and youth from low-income households, who never played sports, identified the cost of sports and the inability to get to practice, so the transportation issue and safety as the key drivers, deterrents to participation. So, and these were disproportionately of greater concern to African and Hispanic families. So here you see the intersection of race, ethnicity, and income level. So another deterrent in sport is, we're calling it teasing here, and in the surveys themselves, we asked both kids and their parents about whether or not their children were made fun of, or the kids, did they see themselves being made fun of. And here you can see that amongst the current, the dropouts in particular, these pictures are blocking my view, my slide. Okay, that girls, as they get older, right, they perceive that they are being made more fun of, and boys, it's the opposite. So that this is a factor. This is an important factor. Almost half of all the girls who are teenagers agree that sometimes people make fun of them. So I think that this, is something that's certainly probably related also to bullying, although we did not actually ask about bullying. So there are gender stereotypes that must be addressed. A third of parents endorse the belief that boys are better at sports than girls, regardless of whether the child was currently playing, dropped out, or never played. So we haven't gotten past this idea that boys are not better than girls at sports, that there are other, the reasons that girls or boys are good at sports is because they've gotten the training and the experience to participate in sport. So that's a lot of parents' minds to change. Parents can play multiple roles, and from the data, we found out that parents, as you might expect, of current girl athletes are more supportive than parents of girl dropouts. They're more likely to provide transportation, to attend games, to buy equipment, to provide food, pay for opportunities to play, to take their daughters to watch sporting events. So all these factors are important. When you think about the programs that you serve, and you think about the coaches who have such a strong impact on the boys and girls, we can't forget that the parents have very, very important roles to play in this, and can definitely impact whether boys and girls and boys stay in sport or drop out of sport. I think it's clear from the research here that girls need greater exposure to female role models. They are, as you can see from the slide, 2/3 of all current players, boys and girls, reported having a male coach. So that's 68%, and or male assistant coaches. 88% of all of the coaches of boys were male, and only 42% of girls coaches were male. So again, there's not enough women who are coaching, not enough women who are role models for girls as coaches. So following that also, again, only about 13% of current girl players' parents and 11% of dropped out girls provided encouragement to their daughters to follow sports figures. So there's very few parents who are actually doing the work to show their daughters that there are women who are playing sport at a high level, or that even if you're talking about the younger girls who are, say, in the 7 to 10-year-old age range, who they're not even seeing maybe the high school players who could be the role models for them. So this is an area where there's a lot of opportunity to make improvement. Only about 1/3 of parents, current parents, and only 1/4 of those who dropped out reported that they take their children to watch sporting events. And this was something that was disproportionately a resource provided to youth from middle and higher income households, and especially boys. So again, here is an opportunity where we can get girls more role models by taking them to sporting events. So the majority of parents, this is a complicated slide, so I don't expect you to be able to study it all right now, but the majority of parents all the way across all youth status here endorse that sports promotes a positive body image. That's not a surprise, but certainly parents of current players were especially likely, so those are the blue parents on this particular slide, the blue chart, part of the chart. So current players were much more likely than those who dropped out or those who have never played to say they feel confident about their bodies. They were more likely to say their body was getting healthier, less likely to say that they don't like the way their body looks, and less likely overall to say that they feel awkward about their bodies. So you can see here that there are ways in which kids are feeling about themselves. This is the internal factors that we were talking about, which are definitely reflected in the data to show that if you're currently playing sport, here are the benefits for that. Coaches certainly shape the sport experience for kids, and you know that better than anyone. They for both boys and girls, and this is something, by the way, this idea that I'm just about to talk about liking your coach, is something we've been studying for a while in a previous research report, Coaching Through a Gender Lens. This turned out to be a really important factor, whether or not girls liked their coach and how much they liked their coach. And in this particular study, both boys and girls, who are currently playing, reported that they liked their coach more than sport dropouts, and dropouts were more likely to have liked their coach only a little or not at all. So this is really the lens, the big lens sometimes that kids are looking through, is that they see their coach and they like their coach, they stay. They don't like their coach, they exit. Another factor that we've been studying for a while is this idea of loving your sport, right? So liking your coach, really liking your coach, and loving your sport, and how those are connected. And our previous research has shown us that they're very connected. That that girls who love their sports also really like their coaches. So those two things are connected to one another. So current athletes reported a love for their sport and with significantly more teen girls endorsing this love of sport compared to boys. So this is, you know, maybe boys keep playing and they don't need to love the sport. They just get a lot of other social support and maybe parental support, peer support for participating in sport. But for girls, they seem to, if they're going to stay, if they're going to be in it, they have to love it. There are too many other competing things, and there's stuff in the there's data in the, I like how I talk about stuff when I mean about data. There's data in the report that talks about all the competing interests that sport is up against in terms of whether or not boys and girls stay in sport. So this idea of competition is also important. It turns out that some girls really are in it for the competition, and some of them are in it for the fun. And you know, knowing what that is, what the reason is that they're in it should help inform what kind of programming, you know, gets done. So here you can see that this also tends to, whoops, what just happened there? Back, I think. Okay. So you know, here's the in this particular figure here, you're looking at you know, what the percentages of kids that think that their sport participant that competing against others is fun, right? So if competition is fun, or maybe there's something else that's fun about it. But it turns out that particularly for girls, competition seems to become more fun as they get older. And you know, you could see how this could, for those who don't find competition fun, as you get older, where maybe competition is more important to the sport experience as it's currently constructed, then if they don't think that's fun, then they're exiting. And you're left with the girls who in fact like competition. Okay, and finally, this was something that we didn't really set out to study particularly, but it turned out to be an interesting finding. That, you know, despite the fact that there's just a lot of evidence that shows that sports can have a positive impact on academic performance and achievement, in this particular study, almost a third of the youth and boys and girls and their parents, you know, reported that they needed to focus more on studying and grades, and that was a primary reason for dropping out of sport. So in the top half of the figure, you see that the numbers of participants who feel that, you know, they agree that participating in sports can get in the way of academics. And when you look at the dropouts, which is the part of the chart on the right-hand side there, the boys and the girl, where the boys and the girls are broken out, you see that as girls get older, they really think that participating in sports can get in the way of academics. For boys, the percentage is high as well, but for girls it's particularly high. And parents as well, on the bottom half of that chart, you'll see that for dropouts, again, particularly as girls get older, it gets more important, but parents are even more likely to think that academics, that sport interferes with academics. So we have some work to be done here to educate parents and youth on the academic benefits that flow from sports participation. I'm going to throw it back to Karen here.
Great. Thanks, Marge. So as with all of our reports, we take the data and the findings and we start to build a list of practice and policy implications and recommendations. And we do this in concert with a whole host of other folks, and this list is constantly evolving. So we're gonna share with you just some of those. And of course, really always interested in more of your insights and thoughts. Typically we break down the practice and policy recommendations by audience. So we have some geared specifically toward parent and caregivers. We have others that are more geared toward teams and organizations and leagues. So for our purposes today, I'm going to share a few of those that are more geared toward organizations. And the first one is start by performing a needs analysis to better understand specific barriers to participation and constraints. So of course, the most important thing is what we do with that needs analysis, but that is the starting point, is really to take the pulse of the organization in the specific community. They know themselves best. And that's a really important starting point, with the goal, of course, of fostering a supportive climate, an inclusive climate for all girls, especially girls in marginalized groups. Second practice and policy recommendation is to enhance inclusion work with leaders who live,
Yep, that was me.
who live and work within the community. And again, most of what I'm sharing with all of you, because you're professionals in this space, is very obvious. But we all know that the folks on the ground who live and work in communities are really the best able to help build those inclusive spaces with our support. Third is to train and empower coaches, which is all the wonderful work that you do. Important to include those folks who are local to the area to really ensure that the programs gain traction and are sustainable over time. And that also includes, of course, training and empowering young people who are in the program and soon to age out, but have great capacity to serve as mentors and role models. Fourth, of course, from the research side, this is critically important, and that's systematically evaluating the effectiveness of the program. And we know that we can do this in so many different ways, whether it's surveying participants or volunteers, or getting feedback from staff, and also importantly, community stakeholders to really understand both the points of pride for a particular program, as well as areas needing more attention and improvement, and also more support from the community. 5 is finding new and innovative and creative ways to promote opportunities for girls to participate in a wide variety of sports. Of course, there are many different pathways, right, toward physical activity and sport participation, and we want to make sure, and we do this in many ways through our funding, and that is supporting organizations that offer non-traditional sports to girls. And most important, I think, with this point, is making sure that girls, regardless of their ability or their interest in traditional activities, have a place to go. We always talk about helping girls to sort of recognize and identify with their inner athlete, and how can we do that if we're not giving them a rich menu of activities to choose from that really suit their interests and their style. 6 is evolving your program with the changes of youth sport needs and interests. Some of that is consistent with what I just talked about in number 5, but a lot of that has to do with really staying on top of and monitoring things like the cost of participation, and how that can often obviously be a barrier, and what we can do about that. The safety and transportation issues, which are so significant, especially in low-income communities, and are a huge concern for parents. Really understanding what the current context is in the community, so that we can see what programs need more support in those areas. And 7, educating girls and parents on the synergy between sport participation and academics. Marge spoke about that in the last slide, and some of the very common misperceptions about sport, thinking that it will get in the way of academics, which we know not to be true. And a lot of research from our own studies and other sources very much supports this notion that girls who are physically active and participate in sport do better academically, both in terms of attending classes, their focus, their time management skills, etc. So we have to, challenge ourselves to figure out how we can better communicate this to parents, and really make that connection apparent, not just for their kids' lives now academically, but for all the opportunities, right, that sports provides for them as they look toward the future. So just to wrap up this portion before we take questions, Marjorie and I just wanted to share with you some of the most recent WSF initiatives. And of course, they all flow from the research. And some of these you may be very familiar with, maybe not so much the others. So I'll just take you through them very briefly. First is the Equity Project that was launched this past February in conjunction with National Girls and Women in Sport Day. And it's an outgrowth of one of our most recent research reports called Chasing Equity, which is really a landscape study of girls and women in sport. It's very comprehensive. It includes a lot of secondary data, as well as a new signature study from the Women's Sports Foundation surveying women leaders in sport. And this initiative is really designed to mobilize the entire sector toward working toward some measurable shared goals. So it's really a collective action project. And in this regard, the WSF is serving sort of as a catalyst and convener, bringing together organizations in the not-for-profit sector and the business sector and the youth-serving community to really inspire our shared goals and our work together, and working to elevate that work and give it more visibility. The second initiative is a new research report that will be released later this summer. It's called Communities at the Forefront, and it's really a 5-year look back at the work that we've been doing to support community-based organizations throughout the country through our Sports for Life program, which is funded by ESPNW. We really look at sort of best practices within those programs and how they're impacting youth attitudes and behavior. We study stakeholders, we look at capacity building initiatives, and taken together, they really provide a lot of great evidence for the importance of youth sports. And when I started at the outset, I talked about the importance of our research, but really I think at this point in time, with the health crisis that we face and the threats to local programs, we're hoping to release this study as programs are returning to programming, so that we can provide further evidence of the critical value that sports are playing for young people, especially during these uncertain times. The next is the Teen Girls in Sport report, which will be released this fall. And that's really an extension of the 2018 WSF report, Teen Sport in America, Why Participation Matters. And it really takes a deep dive into the health, the academic, and the psychological benefits that girls accrue from sport. Fourth, and I mentioned this, are Sports for Life national and regional programs. We continue to fund organizations throughout the country with priorities for organizations that serve low-income girls, African-American and Latina girls. And we've shared, I know in the past, all of the measurement tools that we use to sort of monitor the impact of those programs. And that work is ongoing, and of course made more challenging by the pandemic. And we've been doing a lot of listening of late to really understand what the critical needs are for these organizations, and really reconsidering the way that we require them to apply the funding, because these are, I hate to use the word unprecedented, but unprecedented times. So we're trying to look at this really flexibly and really meeting their needs. Fifth is our Athlete Ambassador Program, and that's where we have a wonderful group of elite athletes who really speak to the issue Marge alluded to earlier, which is the lack of female role models. So these are wonderful spokespeople for the Women's Sports Foundation, but more important, they provide an opportunity for girls across the country to learn more about the power of sport through athletes who share their personal journeys, their challenges, their triumphs. And we do that mostly in person, but during this time, we've been hosting virtual ambassador visits and having girls from our community-based organizations ask questions in real time, so that they have those face-to-face interactions. Sixth, this is not even hot off the press yet, but it will be shortly. We've developed a series of discussion guides to further the work of our Sports for Life organizations, and all of our resources are available to any organization that would like to use them, these discussion guides included. And they will focus on the 4 kind of foundational pillars of our community-based work, and that's leadership, self-esteem, self-confidence, and perseverance. So they're designed to be sort of dynamic tools that program leaders can use. And I will say the timing is just right, because a lot of these discussion guides can be used even without in-person programming, and really help to keep girls engaged. And then finally, our latest initiative, which really builds on all of the research we were talking about today, as well as the Gender Lens report Marge alluded to earlier, is our GoGirlGo digital curriculum. Some of you may be familiar with GoGirlGo. It's a curriculum that was first crafted in 2001 and has been used over 2 decades with millions of girls. And we've been really waiting for the opportunity to modernize and digitize that and host it on an LMS platform and make it more flexible and seamless in the way that program leaders can use it. So that is really in the early stages of development. And again, we'll build off of all of this research and best practice, and that's scheduled to go live first quarter of 2021. And will serve girls between the ages of 8 and 13. So I think that's a wrap in terms of our initiatives. And now we're happy to open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, y'all. I think there are a couple of questions that are sort of more quick hitters. I know we have about 19 minutes to do the Q&A, and we got lots of questions in for this Lunch and Learn, which is exciting. There was a question that was just posted about the discussion guides, whether they're broken down by age.
Whoop.
Oh, you're muted, Karen.
Sorry, the discussion guides are really designed to be used for our Sport for Life programs, and they're required to serve girls 11 to 18. Now, having said that, obviously that's a huge, huge age range. So there will be pieces in there that are appropriate for early adolescence and for later teens. So it's not for really young girls necessarily, although as you know, people use their discretion, but it's really for that teen audience.
Great, thanks. And then we'll just start from the top to Meredith, and then Hillary and Danielle. So Meredith.
Sorry, wasn't sure if I was going to unmute or if you were reading it. Yeah, so I think this is all really interesting. I think I actually had one question and one point. So one question that I had was whether or not the study was looking at parents' involvement in sports, because I think that often has a huge influence on whether kids are involved in sport.
Sure, we do. Go ahead, Marge. Sorry.
I was just going to actually try to look up that slide. But yes, it does look at that, and it does, as I recall, the parents who have participated in sport were more likely to have kids participating in sport.
Right, and we ask everything from the logistical piece, which is taking kids to practices and competitions. We talk about buying equipment. So those are some of the practical aspects of parent involvement that are usually really necessary for a girl to become involved. But then Marge pointed to some of this data having to do with taking girls to sporting events, right? And other things like encouraging girls to follow media, sports figures in the media. So we do have that broken out by current participants and dropouts, and we can certainly share that slide. But as Marge just said, parents, not surprisingly, who were active athletes themselves are often, report higher levels of engagement. But we know all these things to be important.
Yeah, we asked them actually about if they played as a child, did they play in high school, college, competitively, and are they currently playing as well? So yeah, you'll see that they were more likely, if they had experience playing sports, more likely to have kids who play sports.
Awesome. And then the other kind of point or question that I had was a lot of times, with the kids dropping out of sport, I was interested when you mentioned that, girls weren't as supported in their sport by a certain age, and like boys were more supported. And I wonder if it's more so that they're more supported, or it's expectation. So like that boys are expected by their parents and peers to continue to play sports through an older age, whereas as girls, because we see more of a dropout, maybe it's more of an expectation or allowance that they can have that option. And if more boys were given that option, if they would also step back at a certain competition level or a certain age.
We didn't exactly ask about expectations, but we did ask parents about their perspectives on their children playing sport. And of course, if they thought it was really important for their child to play sports, they were more likely, current participants had parents who thought it was more important, right? And that was also reflected in the kids' attitudes as well. Obviously, if they were playing, they thought it was important that they play. Now, did we break that down? I'm not sure if we had that broken down by gender or not. No, I don't think so.
No, and some of this, we can make some inferences, right? Certainly we could have asked that more deliberately, and I'm not sure that we did, but there are some inferences we make when taken together as a whole. We look at parents' perceptions of girls versus boys. We look at the academic data as an example, or time management, and the way that it differentiates between boys and girls. So I think taken as a whole, we make some inferences, but I don't think that we asked that expectation question specifically.
Okay. Well, all really great information. Thank you so much for presenting. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle, or sorry, Hillary.
Hi, trying to unmute. Yeah, so I have two questions I'll kind of smash together. One is, if you control for income, what do you see, how do you see that affects participation by race? And then also, it seems as though Asian girls and Native American girls are not included in this, and can you speak to that?
Yeah. To that point, we do include that in the demographic question. I'll have to look at the sample size because it's often with a sample size of 3,000 young people, it gets too small to be meaningful. But we do ask that, and clearly there's much more work that we need to do in making sure that we oversample so that we can get more specific data on all of those demographics. To answer your first question, did we control for income? We see the rate, consistent across all of the research, we see racial disparities in the participation, retention, and dropout rates. This one in particular, we see that intersection, but we can go and sort of tease that back out.
And I would also say, in the charts, it was in an early slide about the participation in sports by race, ethnicity, and the one by income, where there's a very large other category, right? That includes probably, all the racial and ethnic categories that did not get large enough to be broken out. And after we did the study, actually, this is, sometimes you have these little aha moments. We did the study and we're like, wait a minute, we didn't do anything on kids with disabilities. Like, how could we forget that? So yeah, there's still a lot more work to do.
Great, Danielle.
Hi, thank you. Your last slide, I saw that you actually do have the girls play Los Angeles. One thing that really stuck out to me when I first found out about that program was it was designed and created because predominantly Hispanic families focus more on the gender roles, and that they'll put their sons before their daughters into sports or spend money on their kids. Would we say that that is seen nationwide in all of our different communities? And are there other programs like Girls Play Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think there are certainly the impacts of culture on all of these things, but in one of the first data points that Marge shared about parents' perceptions, among girls and boys, that's across the board. So I think it's easy to say, well, it's just based on culture. And clearly there are cultural influences at play. But I think, to be sure, nationwide, we still see that parent perceptions have a long way to go. And that's pretty pervasive and quite frankly, pretty alarming that in 2020, among parents raising sons and daughters, that those attitudes prevail.
Yeah, I was even going to say, I realized after reading kind of about Girls Play Los Angeles that my mom never got to play sports, or she played at school softball. And I know it was big for her to get me into sports. And I really had to think about it. She goes, well, you know, Nana didn't have enough money to put me into softball, but the wall is filled with my uncles in football. So it was kind of eye-opening of, oh my God, this has been a thing since the 70s until now.
Sure. And that can work both ways, of course, right? So we hear lots of stories like that where a parent didn't have the opportunity to play, whether because of culture or socioeconomics. And so now they're very intentional and very determined to give their girls those opportunities. But then again, you have parents, because of those same reasons, who did not play. And the research clearly shows that if a parent hasn't had a sport opportunity, they're less inclined in general to seek those participation opportunities out for their girls.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will just add on to that, you know, we did try to look at all the racial and ethnic differences we could. And if we found some, we pointed them out in the report, right? If we didn't find any, we generally reported them as just all parents or all children, or we were boys and girls. You know, the important thing that we were really looking at as a start here was, you know, current participants versus dropouts versus those who never played.
Yeah, and of course, we can't overlook the role that socioeconomics plays, right, across all race and ethnicities. It's a huge impediment. It goes without saying, but you know, it just compounds all of those prevailing attitudes or personal experiences. Above all, even with the best of intentions, a lot of parents have to make those very difficult choices, and you know, pay to play and all the costs associated with sport can be monumental.
Great, thank you. Kevin?
Hi, thank you. So I noticed that one of the variables that you mentioned right at the start was early specialization sports and athletes. So I was just wondering if you found that the dropout rate was higher for those girls who were involved in early specialization sports like gymnastics, tennis, and also what was the biggest contributing factor to girls that specialized early dropping out?
Yeah, I mean, this report didn't really dive into the issue of specialization. Certainly, we've learned a lot about that from other research, you know, including the Aspen Institute. Our teen sport report really does, to a degree, talk about actually the benefits of playing multiple sports. And we know that boys are more likely to play multiple sports than girls. So there are a whole host of reasons why that might be, but clearly the sport experience for girls and boys is so different. And we can read into some of the reasons why girls are likely to play fewer sports. And we can attribute perhaps some of that to specialization and the time required. But this report in particular didn't study the specialization phenomenon necessarily. It does look at things like competition, but that's a whole different issue.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. And we have Jameson next.
Yeah, and real quickly, Marge and Karen, do you have a couple minutes to stay on just for a few more questions? Could we keep you on for 5 to 10 more minutes?
Sure.
Sure.
Is that okay? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Everyone else, please feel free to stay on. We, of course, understand you might have some meetings. But my question, if I can find it, oh, yes. My first question is, and I'll only ask one at this point because there are others. So I found it really interesting to see that the attitudes of girls that dropped out, so things like confidence, were often worse, more negative than those that never played. If I read the chart correctly. And so I just wanted to see what you think are the main reasons behind that. I provided some examples in the chat, but without asking too leading of a question, I'd love just to hear your thoughts.
So let me make sure I'm understanding. You're asking why girls who are dropouts might have lower, less positive feelings about themselves than girls who never played.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at some of the reasons for dropping out. Marge alluded to some of these earlier, whether or not a girl feels a sense of belonging, experiences fun, has a strong and positive feeling about one's coach. So if you have sort of a negative sport experience, that might be have more negative consequences to a girl's sense of self than someone who, where it's benign, they haven't had any experience at all. So we obviously want to be very mindful of the incredible influence that a girl and boy sport experience has on their sense of self. We all know it's a tremendous responsibility, and the adults in their lives in these sport settings play a really significant role in helping to shore that up. And we of course know how that plays out in a very positive way. But if a girl has dropped out of sport and it wasn't necessarily for reasons around cost or transportation obstacles, but it was because she had a negative sport experience, it's not at all surprising that that would adversely affect her sense of self, because it's a very powerful experience.
Just to add on to that, I'm looking at that chart right now, and I'm this issue about feeling confident about their body. It's clear that the current participants feel more confident. You can tell by looking at them. But in terms of the comparison between the dropouts and the never playeds, it does look like, they are, in terms of the very true for me versus the sort of true for me, very true is, more, a more popular answer for the ones who've never played. But I would say that when you add the second one and second option there, sort of true for me, they're pretty darn even. Right, so they about have the same, like 82% versus 84%. So I don't think there's really much there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Great. And then Meredith, is this a question or a point you were making in the chat?
I think she might have already
Okay.
or asked that, yeah.
Okay, we'll jump to Paul.
Hi, Marge. Hi, Karen. Great
Hey,
to
how's
see
it
you guys.
going?
This was amazing. Thank you so much. And it was just great to spend some time really delving into this report. So thank you. I have two questions that may be a little extraneous to the report. And one, Marge, you sort of answered with Meredith, but I want to say it more explicitly is, I was in looking at the body image and the benefits of playing sports for for girls. I was wondering, like, how much parental education may be a factor that we as a youth sports sector haven't really delved into enough, or have we? And that's kind of my question. Have we ever looked at how much do parents know about the benefits of sports psychosocially, in terms of addressing trauma, mental health, in terms of the academic wellness skills that it presents, which you rattled them off, Marge, before. But have we ever looked at the correlation that parents understand the overall significant contributions of health to a child's youth potential development, and then the correlation to whether or not their kids play sports and for how long?
Yeah, I think that it's pretty clear, and in this report, parents certainly understand that sport helps build a positive body image. They get that. and when you juxtapose that against how there are such a large number of parents who don't seem to understand the academic benefits, I wonder, that's where to me, that's where the opportunity is there. If we're going to change some minds about kids being involved in sports, then, educating parents about how it can help academically, and even the kids probably get that attitude about academics from their parents. So educating, the parents could be a game changer, I think, on that front. So I do think there's that they do seem to understand, and I think we have other data as well. It's escaping me right now which report it is, but I think parents do, and I think it's in the Gender Lens report as well.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, parents do understand that there's a lot of benefits that their kids get from sports.
Having said that, I think tactically speaking, we need to get a little bit more granular, right? It's not always particularly helpful to talk about it in general terms. I think that parents are really looking out for their kids' well-being, and we talk about sports generally. I think you'll get most heads nodding that sports, are healthy and they're good for kids, but what does that mean and what does that look like? And I think really calling out the specific personal attributes and the specific personal skills that accrues from sport that are very much linked to all of the things they aspire to for their kids, I think we're going to be more effective. So I think we need to start speaking more specifically about, well, what does that really look like? How does that manifest? Not just in the sports setting, whether we're talking about goal setting or teamwork or communication, but what does that look like outside of sport, right? When they walk away from that sports setting, how does that impact their interaction in their family, with their community, in school? I think there's a lot more that we can do. And we certainly get a lot of that anecdotally, but from a research perspective, I think we can even quantify that a little bit more.
It's
Yeah.
interesting.
If I could just add on to Karen's there, one thing we didn't talk about today was in the survey of parents and of the kids, we asked them about do sports have too much risk for injury, right? And so it turns out that for the parents who've never played, who have kids who've never played, more than 60%, almost 2/3 of them, thought that sport had too much risk for injury, versus current participants, which was about half that. So there are, there's that factor as well. So a negative side factor. So there's just a lot of opportunity for educating parents about, and for figuring out, like, maybe there is too much injury risk, and how do we reduce injury risk, right?
Yeah, I just and to that point, I think I'm always looking from a tactical perspective of how do we get outside our choirs, because when we go to like a project play summit, it's all the same people we know every year. It's like a reunion. You might as well wheel a keg into it and just have a big, because we get to see each other, So how do we get outside our choirs? And I keep thinking there's something in that parent education piece, and getting like more parent groups that maybe aren't necessarily sports groups to understand why this report matters and what it says about, in all these reports and the work we're doing. I know there's another question I don't want to hog. I will say that the other question I had was extraneous, so you don't have to answer it here, but I was struck by the presentation that our very own staff member, Hadu, who I think has a question after me, gave about sports and girls of color. And one of the things she talked about was the pressure that's placed on the girl, or sometimes even the teen, to speak up when they're experiencing. And you talked about the you didn't call it bullying, but I forgot what you called it. But
being
when
made fun of. Yeah.
What's that?
Being made fun of.
Yes, but the pressure often to this day in sports culture still falls on the athlete or maybe the team to speak up, but it doesn't fall on the institution. And until the institution set up that this is what we tolerate, and no, you can't be suspended for a game and come back after saying derogatory or bigoted language to another player. So I know that's not a part of here, but I was kind of struck while we were talking about girls, what is the institutional application of these kinds of findings to set up ground rules that hopefully can change the systems. But with that said, I don't know if we have time. So I know Ahada's next, and I want to be sure she gets to ask her question. But feel free to give a quick comment back.
Sure. I'll say that we do, in our Teasing Equity report, we talk about some of the systemic institutional ways in which organizations, institutions, organization leaders can take responsibility. And in fact, we have a line in this report specifically that says it's not on girls alone, right, to make these things happen and to accomplish this. It's really the adult leaders in their lives and the institutions that have to sort of set that, not just set the tone, but also follow through on ensuring that girls are in a safe and inclusive environment. So it's in there, but I think it certainly deserves more attention.
Great, thank you, y'all. And I know that we are 6 minutes over time now. We did perfectly segue to Ahada's question, so we'll take that one last question from Ahada. And for those whose questions weren't able to be answered, I'll go ahead and bring that into an email, and maybe Karen and Marsh could answer that in email, and I can relay it back. Thanks so much. Ahada?
Unmute. Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really helpful for what I do here at Up2Us, but also as a coach. I've used some of the reports that you all have done in the past to kind of guide my policies and procedures for how I deal with athletes. And I think, Paul, you know, in terms of talking about, you know, that piece about parents, I have used this information to have discussions with parents of my 14-year-olds or my 13-year-olds to say, hey, listen, this is around the time that girls start to quit. So let me give you some information about how you can keep your daughters engaged. Here are the benefits to her staying engaged. And here are some of the things that she's going to learn by staying engaged. And so I appreciate everything that you guys do. But my question is, so for years, we've been kind of using, you know, the finding that girls were dropping out at twice the rate than boys were. And from this study, it looks like now it's leveled out a little bit, possibly. So can you speak a little bit about why is that? Are we doing a better job at our girl initiatives and we're doing some of these things and so they're not dropping out at the same rate? Or are boys dropping out at a higher rate now? What's happening? Why is that leveled out a little bit?
Yeah, we were a little bit surprised. I have to be honest, we were a little surprised. And it may be that, you know, in the past when people, we were very specific, as Karen sort of described at the top, about defining dropout. Like, we really wanted to talk about kids who played sports and have really stopped, not switched sports, right? And we, you know, in other, I think we asked them about their intention to participate, and that's how we got to drop out. Like, if they said, no, I'm done, right? They'd drop out. I can't remember exactly, but at any rate, so I think we've been talking about maybe different things in past reports. It may be that in previous surveys we've done, girls drop out and then they come back in later. But now when we really just talk about kids who have really dropped out, you know, then there's not that big of a difference between boys and girls. However, you know, you have to take into consideration that the disparity is really in how many girls are participating versus how many boys, like what percentage of girls are participating. So if you have 100 girls participating and 200 boys, and half of them, you know, drop out, and each, you end up with 50 girls and 100 boys, and you still have the disparity. And, you know, so it's sort of like, are we, you know, missing the real thing we should focus on here? But yeah, I think we have to probably look into that more deeply in terms of dropout. You know, we tried to really focus on dropout this time, and I'm not sure we're quite there, but yeah, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I would venture to say also that things like cost and sport specialization that were alluded to earlier are increasingly an issue across the board. So it's not saying at all that things are equal, and certainly girls of color, girls in low-income communities, those in other marginalized communities are more likely to drop out overall. But I think there are a lot of variables that are really creating, never use the word a level playing field, but really getting in the way of a whole lot of people in a way that may be increasing over time.
Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Marge and Karen, again for spending time with us. I guess like any good researcher, you know, I guess you can the evidence, you know, tells you this requires some further investigation. So looks like you'll have, you know, more work to do and subsequent reports, and we look forward to reading them. Yeah, just being in touch on a number of different levels. I will just say, as a quick action item, just so I can hold myself accountable, I would like to connect you directly with Ahada, who's leading our kind of all girls initiative through Adidas. Hopefully we can keep talking on the research front as well. So thanks again from all of us at Up2Us, and glad to hear you're both doing well.
Terrific.
Thanks.
For having
Thanks
us.
so much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
All
Really
the work you
appreciate
do.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.